Welcome to Everything About You Matters, a relational clinical social work podcast. My aim with my guests is to discover the myriad ways clinical social workers make sense of the human experience and build toward a more just world, one person, family, and community at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Lance Peterson, a licensed independent clinical social worker and social work professor in the Morrison Family College of Health, School of Social Work at the University of St. Thomas. In our last episode with Quinnita Abraham, we explored social work practice. Today with my guest, Mandy Weinkauf, we continue this exploration through the lens of someone with experience in school social work, as well as an array of other social work roles. Mandy Weinkauf is an LICSW, licensed school social worker, and clinical supervisor. She has over 2 decades of experience in care, connection, and compassion, helping individuals and systems move forward with hope. Her 25-plus years in K-12 education include direct student support, family partnership, interdisciplinary collaboration, and program leadership, centering dignity and sustainable care. Mandy currently works as a professional development specialist for Agate Social Works, coaching educators on building supportive systems focused on regulation, belonging, and well-being. Mandy is a higher education professor at the University of Minnesota, teaching trauma-informed workplaces, and the University of St. Thomas, MSW students. She has also developed coursework for the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Institute of Trauma-Informed Education at St. Thomas. She provides outpatient clinical therapy, informed by her understanding of trauma's impact on the brain and nervous system. Through this work, she also completes parenting assessments for families involved with child protection systems. She provides clinical supervision to school social workers and offers consultation to various systems through her own business, Luna Rising, across all roles. Mandy strives to lead with compassion, clarity, and a commitment to helping individuals and systems thrive. Mandy, welcome to Everything About You Matters. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we'll dive right in. Could you just tell us a little bit about these different roles that we just brought up that you occupy now as a social worker?
I'm glad you named them all as reminders to me before we jump in. I'll start with the reason I'm here, probably connected with you too, is our connection to St. Thomas. So I teach MSW fields right now at St. Thomas. And my connection here, also I consult for the Minnesota Institute of Trauma-Informed Education. So I'm a coach and a content creator for asynchronous learning platforms within that system. I also teach at the U of M in the CCAPS program, where I designed a course that's asynchronous for undergrad students called Trauma-Informed Workplaces. I felt strongly that the work that I've engaged in education settings, but also my mental health experience, my social work experience, I'm like, everyone in the business world needs to know this information because it impacts how we lead, how we engage with each other as colleagues. So that's been a fun journey for me, getting to branch out of the mental health social work world. In addition, I'm an outpatient therapist, so currently my clients are 6 to 56. So that's been a really fun journey for me. Through that, parenting assessments is never a place I thought I would land, but it made total sense because I've interfaced with families and supported families involved with child protection for my whole career. So to be able to come in as a neutral third party to engage in relationship building in a really short amount of time, but to make recommendations to court systems. What do families need? Where are their strengths? Where are their gaps? What would support safety and sustainability and permanency for family systems? That's been a journey of heart work and head work, I guess, for me along the way. But I'm also, providing professional development still for folks engaged in K-12. So I was a school social worker since 2007 when I graduated here with my MSW. And I love that work. It's the heart of who I am. It will always be the heart of who I am. And I needed to move along. I was burnt out with the intensity of that work for as long as I was in it. And the roles that I served in were really intense as well. But I still get to support the systems, which to me, as a school social worker, I was expected to put an acute quick response to a systematic or a chronic need. And now I get to help the adults in the systems, because if the adults are okay, the kids are going to be better off and have better chances for success. So I get to design and bring in the knowledge that I've gathered over these many years, but also to like inform educators who don't get the opportunity to learn what we do as social workers, systems work, the science of relationships, so to speak, the reality of the impacts of toxic stress and trauma on our brains and bodies, and how it either allows access or stops access to learning for kids. So taking care of those adults as well with their own well-being, their own awareness of their brains and bodies so that they can offer co-regulation to kids. It's been an awesome journey to join in that work as well. And I think that's it, Lance. But actually, one more. So I'm also a business owner, which is a new venture for me as well that I never thought as a social worker I would lean into. But as I work as a contracted therapist, it made financial sense to start an LLC. Who ever knew, right? But with that, now I continue to grow and lean into what do I want that to look like in my future. So I do offer consultation currently to schools. I contract for some to provide clinical supervision, also those supporting special ed due process. So again, I'm still in that mix, but working to support their systems. How do you create sustainable systems now as school social workers are leaning into the reality that we can seek MA reimbursement for the services that are happening within K-12, helping schools understand how to do that?
Oh, so an MA medical assistance, right? So the Medicaid of Minnesota. And I didn't realize that. Is that new policy then?
It's interesting.
It's not new policy, but it's okay.
It's a new practice is how I will name it, which in my opinion is really legitimizing the work that school social workers do within school settings. So we get to lean into our professionalism, lean into the reality of medical necessity, and then schools can recoup funds to support care for kids and sustainability. But it's a stretch for a lot of us, and a lot of ethical dilemmas have come out on that journey as well within school, the role of a school social worker. So there's a lot to unpack, and I'm happy to be a part of that mess. Okay. that I think will be really beautiful, both for us as a profession, but also the care that we're able to offer kids and families within that system.
When you say ethical dilemmas, could you maybe give an example of that? I was trying to conjure up in my mind something. I was not sure what that would be, like an example, what that might be.
My initial personal ethical dilemma was I'm being asked to give to diagnose a kid in a school setting, but only a kid who is eligible for medical assistance. So there's a lot there that I would love to unpack even further someday, right? But why this group of kids?
In other words, there's a discrimination piece to it where it's just these kids that have medical assistance.
Correct.
Okay.
And I had to lean into that's where it's starting. But there's so many times that I'm like, I'm not going to give a Z code where a Z code doesn't need to be given. And that's where I finally landed, right? I'm going to lean into ethics of my profession. And as a social worker, I'm not going to check boxes for the sake of checking boxes. And I'm going to work to inform families and caregivers. What does this even mean? What am I asking for? But I'm going to work to create equitable and sustainable systems so that the human piece of it isn't lost in the mix. So,
for our listeners, quick reference to Z codes again. Just tell us what Z codes are.
Thank you. So Z codes are in the DSM. So it is a medical code to determine a mental health diagnosis.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned parent assessments a little bit ago, and I was wondering, with parent assessments, is there a standardized way that that's done, or is it more sort of guidelines for things that you need to ask about, but then you have some more liberty to ask about those things?
Yes, and
Okay.
is my answer. So yes, there is a structure. The agency that I work for, Resiliency and Health Institute, they have county contracts. So there's a structure that has been established through norms, but they are aware of the structure that we're using. So yes, there are questions that are really intentional. There are different interview components. So I'm asking families to tell me their own histories, their developmental histories, trauma exposures. But then I can lean in where I feel like it's going to best help me gain information to advocate for this family. So there is flexibility, and I don't need to force anyone to ask a question. If there's resistance, that's information to me, and I will take that into the context of what I'm doing. But then there are certain sections that are really explicit. I need to ask, do they feel responsible for why they're involved with child protection in the first place? If they could do it differently, would they? What would they do differently? So those pieces are expected and more rigid, but there's opportunity to engage in relationship building to really help me gather and infer information along the way as well.
I'm interested to, I want to emphasize something that I think has become a theme, just talking with people in this podcast, is that even if you're working on behalf of a child, it's so important to really strengthen that family unit. And I'm interested in your take about how that philosophy, that or theoretical position, whatever you want to call it, has maybe changed over the last couple of decades. I say that because in my own experience, I didn't necessarily experience families getting a lot of support if they felt like, kids were, quote unquote, deserved better or whatever. Could you speak to that a little bit?
You just took me back in my mind. So before I was a licensed social worker, I was working for a domestic violence agency doing prevention work in schools. So that was my initial jump into schools, systems, but also the realities that families are facing so many barriers and so many different layers. And shortly after that, while I was in grad school, early 2000s, I was working for a nonprofit where I supported girls who were involved with community corrections. So at the time, girls were going to jail because they weren't going to school, for example. That won't happen now. There's different awareness of there's something going on over here, and we see the reality that if we're criminalizing or continuing to marginalize kids or their families, we're setting their trajectory for the rest of their lives. Where if we can come in with intervention as early as possible to support the system, to support the well-being and care of everyone involved in supporting this kid, that's where we're going to land. It's messy. It's not perfect. But I have absolutely seen that shift, and I think it's important that we continue to lean in to change even that shift. Which kids are we talking about? Which family systems are we talking about? What resources do we need to lean into, and what structural societal changes would benefit everybody, not to mention this family? So to me, that work never ends, but I've absolutely seen that shift along the way. Could
you tell us about, I don't know, do you have more to say about your social work service in schools?
So I think back to, I call myself a baby social worker at the time. Granted, I was 30 years old, right? So I had some life experience, some professional experience, but I was a newly licensed person. And I sought out my MSW so I could be a licensed person in a school system because it supported my ability to grow and be respected as a professional. I started working, I'll give the acronyms of education first and then explain if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I was in a Fed Setting 3 high school program in St. Paul. So it was supporting kids who met criteria for emotional behavioral disorders, so EBD. So we're talking the kids who aren't allowed in the rest of the building because their behaviors are too big and too disruptive for the learning environment. What that meant was that I was in a space supporting 30 or 40 students, majority of whom were in Black and brown bodies, majority of whom were male, all of whom were meeting classification of poverty socioeconomically, whose families had been marginalized by school systems who all were impacted by trauma and systemic racism. And it was ready, go. But I had the opportunity to really learn who I was in that space and to learn how I wanted to practice as a school social worker. It was this dance of like working to create safe relationships with kids and to bridge that relationship safety out to their caregivers, but then also to be their advocate in a system that really wasn't wanting them to be there because they made it hard in schools, right? So I was an advocate within school administration, within districts, coordinating with caregivers, coordinating with mental health workers, CPS workers in the community who maybe didn't understand what school looked like. But that like laid the foundation for how I wanted to practice. So I continued supporting and leading those programs for a big chunk of my career because it was never boring. Right?
I'll bet not.
Right? Like, but to me, there was so much power and opportunity in working with such a small number of kids so intentionally, right? They were there 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's an intense amount of time to spend with your clients. And you get to see so many the dynamic nature of their relationships, their beliefs about themselves in those different relationships, their strengths and their needs. So that was my comfort in my home. But I also loved working so closely with my colleagues. We were a team and a family system working to figure this out for these kids. And it was messy for us together within that because it's an intense environment. But also it allowed us an opportunity to create that safety, meet these kids where they were at every single day, show them different sometimes what a safe relationship with boundaries could look and feel like. But also that belief that we had in them, we hoped to push that onto them, hoped that they would take that into their own hearts as well.
Yeah, for sure. And are you at liberty to talk about maybe a specific type of theory model or some approach that, just something you might use during that time? Because I'm thinking 5 to 6 hours, that is a long time. Maybe some approach we could hear about, what you might have done with them.
Always, 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 I think of self-determination. Because just because I, as the adult, thought it was important that a kid did X, Y, or Z, it didn't matter if they didn't want it. So leaning into what were their values, what did they want for themselves, I would continue to push the envelope of opportunity for them if they didn't believe that they could do it. But self-determination to me has always been big. Within that, though, too, I think of ecological theory, systems theory. I am with this kid for 6 hours of the day, but they have this life that is so big beyond the scope of what we're doing even within school. So all of those systems impact who they are and how they show up that day. But then they have a math class system and a science class system and a hallway system. So all those systems together, and how can I find the dignity and the value in their humanity in those systems to inform how I approach them if things were messy or if things were good, right? So those were big ones for me always, but ethically, leaning into anti-racism has always been a huge value for me as a person, but professionally, it's been a grounding force in all the work that I've done.
Okay. And when you say leaning into anti-racism, because you talked about these systems within the school, and I remember you you earlier mentioned, being an advocate. Did you find yourself sometimes challenging those systems and the way they were set up?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think the beauty was I didn't know what I didn't know, so the fear didn't stop me.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. It's sort of this way of just playing ignorant. Why is this system set up the way that it is? And is there maybe a better way to do this? And, okay. I know this puts you a little bit on the spot. Can you think of an example of maybe one systemic thing that you changed while you were in that work?
Oh, yes. I remember I was in a middle school So 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So 11 to 13, 14-year-olds. And at the time it was again a self-contained program within a big school system. And one of our superintendents was in the building. He was a new superintendent or assistant superintendent. And I said, I invite you to come down to our program anytime. I would love to show you what we're doing, what's working, where we feel like we still need support. And he, gave me that, yep, sounds great. And I said, I just want you to know, I don't like that we are locking kids in seclusion rooms. And we are not doing that in my program.
Wow.
And he looked at me and he said, we're locking kids in rooms.
Interesting. So the superintendent wasn't even aware that this was happening.
Yeah. To me, it was, we are stripping power away from people. Ooh, that gets me every time, right?
Right.
But also I'm like, why would I be in an educational setting intentionally stripping that power away from a person to justify it by controlling them or regulating them? Makes no sense.
I would, and I don't know the research on this, but I have to imagine seclusion rooms would not necessarily have great outcomes, particularly when we're talking about children still with their developmental needs, the growth that they have to go through during that time.
Absolutely. You're 100% right. And we are re-traumatizing when we do that.
Yes. And, some of the things you talked about was self-determination. It makes me think about, and I should just back up and say my umbrella approach is solution-focused therapy, but that's often what I think of, because that solution-focused therapy is really first and foremost about what is it that the person wants that we're serving. And if they don't want it, because you had mentioned this, if they don't want it, I can do everything under the sun to try to get them to want it. If they don't want it, it's not going to happen. And so I really like that piece of allowing that self-determination. And also, that seems to me to really be an anti-racist thing to do, right? Where a lot of times these kids feel like their choices are severely limited.
Oh, absolutely. How was that different than a jail cell for many of my kids? It wasn't. It was the same, right? And again, because of who I was supporting, the kids in front of me are in Black and brown bodies. What am I repeating in that trajectory for them? And I'm proud to say the next year seclusion rooms didn't exist in middle and high school settings in that district. So the right person found out the information. So again, I'm like, here I am telling what I think or speaking what I think or asking the questions that I have. And it created a system change where I didn't necessarily think that would happen, but I knew it wasn't right in my heart. So I knew I needed to say something or do something for it.
That's where I think really where the values and ethics of social work practice, where the rubber hits the road, and such a great example of where our advocacy can make a real difference in a time in a world where it feels like maybe a lot of the things we do don't make a difference. There's these things we can do that really do make a difference. Okay, I want to turn to a role that was brought up, your professional development that you do at schools across the state. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was a great social work story. I was in a virtual training with a bunch of social workers, and I started texting Abby Refsland, going, someone needs to take the show on the road. What are we doing? That was in, I think, December of 2025. And by May, I was on her team.
Wait, 2025?
Uh-huh. Wait, yeah. Wait, no, sorry. Thank you. 2024.
24, okay.
December of 2024.
Okay.
And by May of 2025, I was on her team as a contractor, but also speaking at a special ed director conference in Minnesota. So it went from this like funny idea where she had this company, this school social work company, as another LICSW providing direct service. And she was willing to take a risk with me. It was a passion for her as well to branch out and take care of the grown-ups. And here we are. So I've been able this current academic year, so the 25-26 academic year, I've been at schools across the metro, outstate, K-12 schools, offering those educators an opportunity to understand how trauma and toxic stress impact nervous systems, brain function for kids. And I continue to learn along the way. So it's been this incredible fusion of my own professional experience and the values that I bring as a social worker and a practitioner, but also my work in outpatient mental health. That's informing the trends that I'm seeing when I go speak to these educators in K-12. What I'm hearing from my students in higher ed is informing what I bring back to those educators in K-12. So I think, too, I can't not name the fact that nowhere in the planning was the insurgents, and that was going to happen in Minnesota. The
ice surge is what you're talking about,
Thank
correct?
you.
Yes, yeah.
The occupation is
yes.
the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we did not plan for the occupation to happen, but we were able to respond to it. How do we take care of these adults right now who are scrambling, who potentially are feeling targeted or marginalized themselves right now? That the pervasive fear that was grounding our community, of course, is going to go into schools. And then when we have students being targeted, schools being targeted, that wasn't lost on me, that it was an important opportunity to be able to take care of the adults and offer them space and collective care together. And it led to being able to offer, through the Minnesota Department of Education, I offered a statewide virtual training to educators. What do we do? How do we take care of our kids through this collective crisis? So again, it started from a text communication with another social worker to here we were in front of the whole state, offering our social work wisdom to ground in what was happening, but also support the adults in recognizing their own needs and understanding the science and the hard work of what they needed to do to take care of kids moving forward.
And here, I'm guessing you're talking about the signs of trauma, or little t trauma, I guess in this case, where it's noon. We're not talking about a PTSD diagnosis per se, could be, but we're talking about the trauma they experience from watching what's happening to the kids, knowing what's happening in the schools, and then sort of paying attention to their own feelings and body responses to all of this.
And the pivot that we do as school social workers or as social workers, right? So I signed up for this job where my role was providing care for kids. Now I'm organizing community connections to provide resources for kids and families. I'm walking kids to cars to ensure safety for them. I'm organizing systems. I'm creating like bigger loops of care when I signed up for this job to support this kid, which to me, that's the heart of what we do as social workers. We respond to the need. But absolutely, little t trauma, but also I think the culture of fear that was surrounding so many of us, regardless of where you were in state, outstate Minnesota, it was impacting our nervous systems so much. And I don't think that's gone away. I think what I'm seeing now in my work in supporting systems is the fatigue that educators are experiencing is so significant. Everyone's kind of vacant right now and waiting for the beginning of June for that pause that happens with education. But I think I could give the science reasons behind it, but also acknowledge you're doing the best you can. Which that's what we do as social workers, right? So, yeah, it's been a gift to be able to do that.
Yeah, so that is, and as you say, that's such an important way to build community connections and create, I guess, both compassion for each other, for self, for each other, and really building that knowledge of what happens to the body and brain when kids feel that trauma, that fear, and try to show up to a class to learn. And Quinnita and I talked a little bit about this too, that, kids are not ready to learn when their brains are, being ravaged by this fear and trauma that they experience.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, I was able to be trained with Dr. Bruce Perry. He has, at that time, it was the Neurosequential Network. Now, I was trained in the Neurosequential model in education, which has been a grounding theory for everything that I do. In understanding that, and I took in the content 10 or 15 years ago, but it has such different meaning for me now. So that's a reality, or that is I would say kind of a seminal feature of the work that I offer, K-12 systems.
Can you describe that a little bit for our listeners? Because I don't know that that's something that everybody's familiar with.
Dr. Perry's model, he likes to speak about the upside down triangle, which is really helpful for my visual brain. But he looks at our brains from the bottom up. So the bottom of our brains is our brain stem. That's our basic bodily functions, our heart rate, respiration. And the more we go up the triangle or up our brain, more happens. So the center of our brain, that's where relationships and emotions live. Our limbic system controls our amygdala, which is that beautiful part of our brain that senses danger and ignites different systems in our brains or our bodies. But when we continue to go up into our cortex, which we now know isn't formed until about our 30s or early 30s, that's where executive function skills live. So time management, engaging in tasks, shifting from one task to another, but also that's where hope lives. So if a body is experiencing stress or distress, it ignites all these alarm systems in our bodies. And if I'm a kid who's experienced developmental trauma, so I had a big T or a lot of little t trauma exposures in my early development, it will impact how I see the world, but also how my brain can access itself when I'm under stress. So for example, if I am a kid who at 7, I experienced a big T trauma, I'm now in school, let's say, and something happens and it alerts or it ignites my alert systems. My brain's ability to go up and down in itself and retrieve information and think and perceive and feel, it'll stop at where I was in my brain development at age 7. So when my body is experiencing a nervous system response, it drops my ability to access my full cognition or my full IQ. Mm-hmm. So that's not just a kid thing. It's a human thing. So it happens for us as adults as well. If I hear a fire alarm, an alert center goes off in my body that's like danger, and I jump to react, I'm not able to think first. I feel first. I react first. I can't think first. So when we recognize that's a human thing, we can build in opportunities for the pause, right?
Yeah.
And acknowledging that not everyone is in the top in their cortex when they're making decisions or reacting to something. They might be in their brainstem in the bottom where they're just surviving.
Right. No, I think that's super important. And I think that's why you need to correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you might even be more familiar with this book, but it's one that you recommended for this podcast, the What Happened to You, the book he did with Oprah Winfrey. And that's where I know Dr. Bruce Perry's work. Mm-hmm. I remember him talking about having any time that, somebody who's experienced trauma and they're ready to just talk and have sort of typical conversations, that's the time you really want to engage with them. Mm-hmm. And then when they're not there anymore, you back off.
Yes.
And I would imagine that probably has to do with the way, the triangle brain that we were talking about earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting stuff. I think it feels to me like Dr. Bruce Perry's work has not maybe infiltrated a wide enough audience. It feels like it to me. I'm not sure, because he has years and years of experience with doing research on this.
I agree.
And I was going to ask about that you do some consulting too. Maybe you could tell us about that and how that may or may not fit with the professional development you provide.
It all intersects. It all does, right? But currently, for example, I have a contract with the school where I offer clinical supervision to their school social workers. I'm also supporting special ed evaluations. So the mental health pieces within special ed documents and evaluation. But I also contract for Mighty here at St. Thomas, so the Minnesota Institute of Trauma-Informed Education, where I designed some asynchronous courses for them for systems to be able to learn about the impacts of trauma. And there's a couple schools that I go to once a month to sit with the staff and do a lot of the same things that I'm doing in my professional development work for Agate also.
Okay. One of your current roles, of course, is being an outpatient mental health provider, as you talked about. Will you please start by telling us about, you might have hinted at this already, but any areas of specialty you work on in your practice?
Yeah, responding to trauma is kind of my jam.
That's what I figured. I figured that would be it, yeah.
Yeah, but also supporting folks impacted with neurodivergence.
Okay.
So thinking about my current caseload, the vast majority of people that I'm currently supporting have been diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, ASD, but also pre-birth traumas. So FASD, and I think I landed there because it flows with who I am as someone also with ADHD. There was a synergistic connection there for me, but I think it was informed by the work that I did in schools for so long.
Sure, that makes sense. Can you speak maybe a bit more to the transferability of skills and therapeutic models from school social work to being a therapy provider?
I remember when I was a school social worker, and I had been in LICSW since 2011, so it had been a while. And the idea of working in outpatient mental health terrified me. I did not feel like I could do that work, that I had the skills to do that work. My own imposter syndrome or self-doubt was very real with the idea of being a therapist in outpatient mental health. And when I finally took the leap and started really part-time, I worked 2 nights a week. After school, I'd go and see 3 clients, and I was blown away at the limitations I put on myself as a professional. So I saw it as this position up in the sky that I aspired to be. And I'm like, wait, I've been doing this work all along. And I wasn't giving it enough credit, myself enough credit. But also, I'm like, these folks are really actually doing the best that they can with what they've got professionally as well. So I laugh now that I was as scared as I was for as long as I was. There's so much transferability. It's just mind-blowing to me still, right? The way that the special education due process model and system mirrors the diagnostic assessment and treatment planning process, the way that sitting in IEP meetings helped me sit with families when the child is my primary client. The way that my work at school was who's my client right now? That kind of fits within my outpatient work as well sometimes, as I'm teasing out with clients complex relationship dynamics. So I was scared for a really long time, and now I laugh. Yeah.
Well, I think that's such a great example too, because I think there certainly is a role for specialization and a role for ongoing education. There are things you're going to be doing in outpatient therapy that weren't quite what they were in school social work, and there is this transferability of skills. We often talk in the School of Social Work about the clinical lens, and that it can really apply to a variety of different settings in clinical social work practice. In all your many roles throughout your career, what social work values and ethics inform all the areas of practice you find yourself in?
At the root of it all for me, self-determination, honoring human dignity, the reality that everyone is doing the best they can with what they have. We like to judge each other and ourselves, but everyone's doing the best that they can with what they have. And I think, too, understanding how the neuroscience behind behavior has been so informative for me in my work, in my own transference or countertransference when sitting with a client. The reality that everything is layered, right? So the systems, the experiences that we've all been through, the intersectionality of it all really informs the work that I do.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and kind of comes back to the title of the book with Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, what happened to you, because one of the things that book is getting at is we're getting away from the why are you doing this or what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and I think there's such an element of compassion in that question that addresses sometimes some really serious behavior concerns that we might have, but backs up and says, okay, this isn't how people typically behave. So what happened to you? And I think it's a beautiful way to kind of think of the work that we do as social workers, because we're called on to do that all the time. All right. Well, there's yet another part of your work still that we haven't hit on, maybe more than one, but the supervision.
Yeah.
So currently your supervision is exclusively, I should say, with school social workers. What are the unique characteristics of school social work supervision?
So school social workers don't have a school social work degree in Minnesota. So they have a holistic social work education. They may have had one elective on what being a school social worker looks like. So I get to support even explaining the acronyms sometimes. So the technical side, the educational wisdom that I can offer them and understanding what should an IEP look like? What is your role as a school social worker within this interdisciplinary team? But then we also get to sit in the clinical dynamic nature of the work that they're doing with students, with caregivers, to ensure ethical practice that way as well. But it's a beautiful, beautiful dance sometimes, because we're leaning into, like I said earlier, who's your client? If they're struggling with a teacher, the school social worker is having difficulty with the teacher, we get to dissect that relationship and talk about how can they work to lean into that discomfort, or what kind of bridge can they build with this person to best advocate for their kid, their student. So there's so much of a dynamic nature in comparison to the consultation support I offer, for example, with fellow therapists at my outpatient mental health clinic. The work with school social workers and supervision is very multidimensional, which is beautiful, because they're figuring out who they are in the system that is not a mental health system. So they get to define their role and their professionalism and their ethics within a space that's going to push back against those a lot, but provide ethical, quality care for the student in front of them.
Well, and I have to imagine, and I might be envisioning this on my own, because I know my tendency is, okay, am I seeing something this way because of my own strange experience that maybe nobody else could connect to, or am I seeing it for a different reason? And I have to imagine that there's probably a place to talk about, say, for example, you mentioned the teacher, maybe some countertransference with that teacher. And okay, what are you experiencing with this teacher that is making it difficult for you to really make sure you're as fit as you need to be to serve the child? Like, in other words, how can we help you to figure out this relationship with the teacher and what it is that's really impacting you? Would that be an example of something you might do?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And what is that teacher's experience with the social worker? Or what is that teacher's experience with, they feel stuck with the student and they don't know what to do to help them? So their resistance may be defensiveness, that they can't fix it for this kid, or it's triggering their own responses to power or control or discomfort. It's so dynamic all the time. But yeah, absolutely.
I would have a hard time thinking of a more complicated type of supervision than school social work. Maybe multisystemic therapy, which both of those really involve all the systems. So, or all the systems that are in the child's life in both cases, because that's what multisystemic therapy, at least traditionally, was meant to serve, was children, specifically adolescents with big behavior challenges that could eventually lead them to residential or something like that. We've covered such a vast array of different roles that you've taken on. Maybe one thing that I do like to ask in this podcast is, how do you, and maybe this would just translate right now to your outpatient clinical work, how do you evaluate your practice as a clinician?
Well, as a person, I ruminate a lot, to be fair. So I think like I crack up right now at social media memes where they're like, your client is in your head as you choose the book that you're going to read next. But that is something that I value as a person. Like, how can I honor the beautiful opportunity? Someone's trusting me with their life story, and I'm sitting in this space with them. So checking in with them is really important to me. That I believe in intentional conversation, not just around a treatment plan, but talk to me about how this experience was for you today. Mm-hmm. What would have helped you feel more comfortable in what just happened, right? Leaning into that resistance. But also, I think empowering them to make the choice to not come and see me anymore. I think that there's this belief that sometimes I see clients who feel accountable to me and our relationship, and it's very important to me that I stop that right away, because it's so not about me, right? So continually conversing around how they're feeling about what's happening in our relationship in our time together. But looking at those treatment plans, that's been a really helpful strategy for me when I feel stuck myself, right? Mm-hmm. What was our original plan here? Why were we doing this? Allowing myself an opportunity to pause and reflect. Am I supporting that need? Does that need still exist? Do we need to adjust this treatment plan and refocus our efforts together? But I can't tell you the value that I hold for consultation. So meeting with my colleagues, formally and informally, and really digging into what is happening within that therapeutic relationship. What could I try that I'm not trying? Or where do I really need to just slow down? That's been a big thing for me too, because my brain and body is used to the pace of K-12 education.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So allowing an opportunity for me to calm down, but also not feel the urgency of we need to fix this because there's a bigger goal right now, which is education. Hold on, right? What does the client want support with? What do they need right now from me? Is the safety of my relationship serving them in a way that I maybe don't even understand? But what acute needs, what maybe lifetime needs are present. So revisiting that, questioning my own countertransference, checking in with my own bias and assumption. But yeah, the consultation has been critical for me in evaluating where my colleagues can tell me, this is a long game client. It's okay. Like, whose need are you meeting right now? Yours or theirs? So that's been really helpful for me because I've had to learn how to slow myself inside.
I think that's such a beautiful way to capture, actually the subtitle of this podcast, a relational clinical social work podcast, because it's really outside forces, insurance companies, whatever, that tell us we need to make progress with this client now. And that's not always the reality. And so getting that consultation from your colleagues in service to the client, talking with the client, frequently. And I could be wrong about this. I feel like that idea of checking in with the client, is this serving you well? I kind of feel like came from our postmodern theories, more like narrative theory and narrative therapy, solution-focused therapy. But either way, I think it's a really valuable approach to help, to serve the self-determination you talked about, which is really a core value of yours. So one last question that I always like to ask everybody is, what advice would you give to beginning social workers if they were to consider the type of work you've done throughout your career?
I get to tell my foundation field students right now that the learning continues. And I am so serious when I say that. Like, continue to be a learner. I still learn something every week, and I'm so grateful. That's what has sustained me in this work. So embrace being a learner. It keeps going. That's a big thing first, because I feel like we come out with this expectation that we're supposed to know things now. We have this degree, we have this license, but the learning never stops. And also to work to define who you are outside of your professional self. We encourage our clients all the time to lean into wellness and well-being for themselves. Like, where do you find your joy? I find so much joy in my work, or I wouldn't have 17 jobs, right? But also, I have to take care of me outside of the space so that I can show up the most regulated and the best ready to hold my clients in our time together. So to create the safety of that relationship container. So lean into, who are you outside of this work? What brings you joy? My family used to tease me, like in the grocery store, Target line, like, not everyone needs to know you're a school social worker, Mom. Like, I would find myself just talking about it all the time. So I needed to pivot many different times in my career to recenter who I was. How did I want to live my life, knowing that a huge piece of who I am is a social worker. That's just how I roll. That's why I'm here, right? But also, I need things to sustain and fuel me outside of that as well.
I think that's great advice. One of the I was just thinking of something as you were saying that, which is that defining your place outside of social work, and then also leaning into what defines your unique social work identity too. Because there are some people that will take a career like yours and kind of wear all these different hats and do all these things. And some people that say, well, I'm just going to focus on this particular area. And I think that's where our individual identity comes in. Either way, there's a whole bunch to learn in wherever we find ourselves. And so that was just something I was thinking about as you were bringing that up.
I couldn't agree more. Like, yeah, I know I won't sustain the scope of what I'm doing right now. When I chose to walk away from a salary and a pension position, I cast a broad net on purpose because I didn't know exactly where I wanted to land. And I wanted to get curious with my own self and try different things. After being in a siloed position for a really long time and being good at it, I was like, okay, let's jump into the unknown here for a bit. So now I get to decide, where do I want to land and where do I want to lean? And I don't think I will be someone who stops, but we get that flexibility as social workers. Our license gives us such a broad scope and so many opportunities.
Yes, I think that's very true. And there's, I think both of us are at points of our career where we can say, just allow your career to unfold. It's because I think there's a lot of anxiety about, gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
Yes.
And I don't think it really matters even from your first job. It will take off wherever it needs to take off.
And trust yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And go where you're curious. Explore, read, find spaces where you can have conversations with people. Like, we aren't taught how to network necessarily, right? Because it's not focused on us, but lean into where you're curious. Find like-minded folks or folks who challenge your beliefs and your curiosities, and you never know. Text your friend during a training and here you are, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation today.
Great to be here.
As we close today, I want to thank Peter Monahan and all others who have worked with him in the studio to make the podcast possible. Additionally, I express my gratitude to the University of St. Thomas for providing the resources for this show. Finally, a special thank you to Mandy for joining us today. Hope you'll join us again another time.